So thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm really happy to give this talk. It's, I think, the second gun tea or gun exchange talk that I've given in the last few years. And really pleased to be able to join you during this time when we all need a little bit more connection and conversation. So again, I'm an anthropologist. I'm at faculty here at UVM and also involved with the graduate program in food systems. And the title of the talk today is A Renewed Call for Social Sustainability, Putting Worker Justice at the Center of Sustainable Food Systems. So what I'll be presenting today is kind of, I guess, a little bit of insight into my pandemic mind, the things that I've been thinking about as I've been looking at the impact of COVID on food workers, thinking a little bit about what's happening in my field site here in Vermont around specifically looking at migrant labor, and really revisiting what was probably one of the most influential pieces that I read as a graduate student that I continue to assign. So with that, I'll get started. So just a little bit of a roadmap of where I'm heading. I'll start out by revisiting this, again, really influential essay by Patricia and Carolyn Sachs, which is called The Social Side of Sustainability. I'm doing this in some way as a 30th anniversary celebration. This piece came out in 1991. And the calls that they include in this piece, I think, are as relevant now than they ever were. And I think they give us an important point for considering some of the various challenges that we see in the food systems currently. Really briefly, I'll think about how that argument that they make connects to what is a very well understood idea of the three pillars of food system sustainability, and thinking a little bit about whether those pillars are equal if we pay equal attention to each of those three. Speak briefly about what I am paying attention to with respect to COVID and how that is revealing, I think, really important questions around essential work and essential workers in the food system. And then with that, I'll revisit some of my main findings and some of the conversations that I share in my book. I will fully admit about nearly 2 years after the publication of my book, I'm a little tired of book talks, but I still want to talk a little bit about it. So I'll be sharing a bit about some of my main findings, really as a way of thinking about some of these questions of social sustainability and essential work. And then I'll conclude with thinking about what in my mind are some really exciting openings for, I think, deeper, more complex and more nuanced understandings of social sustainability in the food system with current discourses and practices and really exciting action in the food system that hopefully opens up, I think, again, more interesting conversations of food justice. So now 30 years ago, two of my favorite food system scholars, Patricia and Carolyn Sachs, wrote this essay called The Social Side of Sustainability. I think I first read it in an environmental justice class that I was taking with my dissertation advisor, Devon Pena at the University of Washington. And it was a really influential piece then when I read it. It's probably been about 20 years ago. And it's a piece that when I started teaching my own classes on food and the anthropology of food, I immediately included it as one of the main introductory readings that we look at. I've often told my students in those classes that when this argument that they make is not relevant any longer, I will stop assigning it. But I haven't stopped assigning it. If you've been in any of my food classes or recently or know people who have, most likely this piece has made an appearance. So this piece was really situated, I think, within an interesting context where sustainable agriculture was starting to become much more mainstream in a number of ways. And the dominant discourses around sustainable agriculture were really taking shape. And in a lot of their work, Patricia and Carolyn Sachs really think about the importance of discourse, the importance of how we talk about certain things. You might remember a later piece that Patricia wrote, really, I think, a well-circulating piece in Gastronomica around the disappearance of hunger in America, in which she examines the implications of hunger dropping out of the USDA measurement of food insecurity in the United States. So this piece has a similar message as that one, where really what they're trying to argue in this piece is that if we are going to really achieve sustainability in the food system, we really need to think about the dominant discourses that are framing the meanings of sustainable agriculture. And their argument in this piece was that at that point in 1991, probably a couple years prior, knowing publication life cycles, It seemed like the sort of the attention to more ecological understandings of sustainability were, moving along at a pretty good pace, and the conversations around livelihoods or financial sustainability and economics seem to also be getting quite a bit of attention. But their argument was in this piece that the sort of more social side of sustainability, what I would argue is the side that has a lot more to do with questions of food justice, was not being looked at in enough depth. So they argue while the dominant discourse on sustainable agriculture does raise important problems, there's a tendency to overlook problems such as hunger, poverty, systemic economic concentration, gender subordination, and racial oppression, which, as they argue, are problems that also contribute to a lack of sustainability in food and agricultural systems. So this piece, while certainly a number of really important things have changed since 1991, and I think we are really fortunate to be in a place where our understandings of sustainability have really deepened, and where even sort of mainstream notions of sustainability have gotten a little bit more nuanced. I would argue that their argument is still very important to consider, and that especially as we are in a moment of really intense social upheaval, we are actually seeing some really exciting openings for what they wanted us to achieve, which was a greater attention to some of these problems. As an anthropologist, I'm always drawn into the social side of things. I'm really interested in thinking about society and structural kinds of issues. I was really impacted by this piece as a graduate student, and revisiting it for this talk, I was like, wow, okay, I'm still on board. I still want to think about it. So again, this talk is kind of a celebration in some way of the 30 years that has been passed. But what I want to do is kind of bring this up to date in thinking a little bit about my own field site and what we're seeing with respect to, I think, exciting conversations around food justice. So, for anyone in this room, I'm sure the three pillars of sustainability, or what's often in my mind not so easily called the triple bottom line of sustainability, is something that is very dominant and very mainstream now. This is built into the branding of environmental universities. This is built into sort of any conversation around sustainability, which is that we need to pay attention to social, environmental, ecological, and economic dimensions. And that idea of sustainability has really strongly impacted sustainable agriculture conversations and research. And I think that that's been, there's been a lot of movement since 1991, and I think that that's a really good thing. But I would argue, sort of going back to this original piece, is that these three pillars are still not exactly equal, right? I think about it as sort of a wobbly three-legged stool, where some of the issues which are perhaps a bit more, I would say, tangible, or at least measurable, are a bit more easily accomplished, are also perhaps a bit more strategically researched. But these dimensions around, gender subordination or racial oppression or classism in the food system are a bit more, I would say, what we might call difficult conversations, right? Which, of course, we all have a stake in as people who are socialized to think about, these various kinds of hierarchies. And so, I do think that some of what Alan and Sachs are arguing has been updated. I think that our conversations are further along, but I'm still a little bit hesitant to say that these pillars are completely equally addressed. And in some of my research, I've seen ways that certainly holds true in the field sites where I've been working. So thinking about the past year, which we all are slightly exhausted in thinking about, I'm sure, I think one of the things that I've been really struck by in the last nearly year are the conversations and the discourses around essential work and essential workers. Early on in the pandemic, especially as we started seeing, a lot of the food shortages, I remember going to the grocery store and being very struck by the products that weren't available for some time. We've seen, I think, a really important set of conversations of whose work is essential and who is essential to our food system. And we've seen, whether we're looking at crop production or meat packing plants or restaurants, the conversation around who is an essential worker, I don't think has one clear answer. But I think it also is important to beg the question, especially when we think about the role of immigrants in this food system, of who has legitimate claims, right? Or who is seen to have legitimate claims to be in the United States, to make claims on the state, to make claims for food and workplace justice. I think all of those things are extremely important conversations and don't have one simple answer. And so, we've all experienced this. We all have thought about this. In a really recent piece by Melissa Passanen, a grad from our own food systems master's program, the ways in which restaurant workers are navigating a really difficult reality of all of a sudden having much less opportunity for work is kind of an interesting counterpoint to farm workers who are continually employed, again, as a supply chain analysis might kind of expect in some ways. But I think we kind of have to come to terms in recent conversations, in Europe, for example, about if you're an essential worker, you might have a path to citizenship. I don't think we're quite there yet. But I think in my work, when I've looked at especially the role of immigrant workers, I think it's a conversation that we really need to have about if people are seen as doing essential work, how essential are they themselves to our society, to our economy, to our communities. And I think that, again, there's no easy answer, but the conversations are very important. And I think that the last year has been a place for me to really deepen my own thought process around questions of labor. So I do want to talk a little bit about the research that I've done in Vermont that Sam really nicely talked about, a book that I published in 2019, which is looking at labor in the dairy industry. And as an anthropologist, I try to draw together questions of food access and labor justice and border politics in this book. And it's one that was interestingly timed in terms of the previous presidential administration, in terms of the field work that I did. And now, if I had a chance to revisit this book after seeing some of the changes as a result of the pandemic, I think I would have probably another 5 chapters to write. So I wanted to kind of revisit some of my main findings and share a little bit about what I've seen in terms of changes. So for those of you who don't necessarily have, understanding of this labor practice or this particular industry, in Vermont, we have, according to UVM Extension, roughly 1,000 to 1,200 Latinx migrant workers in the state. Again, because of a variety of interesting dynamics around visa programs and the industry itself. Roughly 90% of these workers are undocumented. And in Vermont, most of these workers are coming from southern Mexico, central Mexico, some countries in Central America, often from places with really important indigenous histories and indigenous practices. And it's mostly a male workforce, especially when we look at people who are working in milking barns, although there are steady numbers of women who are either coming to join male partners or to work on the dairies themselves. And so again, we're not talking about a huge number of people. And as an anthropologist, I think to me, that doesn't really tell me that I shouldn't study that. It tells me that perhaps the smallness of the question begs a lot of examination. And one of the things that I try to think through in this book is, what are the ways in which the US-Canada border sort of perpetuates structural violence against immigrants who are often still grappling with the violence of crossing the US-Mexico border. So border politics and food access really came together for me in this book. So thinking about the dairy industry, again, in the last 70 years, 60 years, it's seen tremendous change. Where we had 11,000 dairies in the 1940s, as of the end of year last year, we had about 645. And alongside all of the consolidation and industrialization that we've seen in that industry, that of course has happened in so many other sectors of the food system, the role of immigrant workers has come to be very important, to the point that about nearly 70% of Vermont's milk comes from dairies employing migrant laborers. And I would estimate that's probably gone up a little bit. That figure's a little bit older. So when we look at some of the changes that we've seen in the industry in the past year, I remember being really struck early on about the number of farms that were dumping milk, because all of a sudden the markets for their fluid milk were drying up as schools were closed and restaurants were shuttered. And so it's been a really volatile year, not only for farm workers, as they sometimes are facing no longer being employed, with farm owners who are facing a really, again, unpredictable and very challenging economic environment. And thinking about food security, which is really my particular set of questions, is this book originated as, in many ways, an extension, a connection to my dissertation research, which looked at food access questions for urban residents in Seattle who had migrated from Latin America. Very different set of questions, very different demographics, very different food landscape that we're thinking about. And so one of the projects that I was trying to accomplish in this work is to understand how food insecure farm workers in the state are compared to their other counterparts in seasonal agriculture, especially. And a lot of those studies have demonstrated that farm workers face food insecurity sometimes 3 to 4 times the national average. And so my initial inquiry was, okay, given that we know that, how are farm workers in this industry faring, given that it's a very different set of labor patterns, the fact that it's year-round work, the fact that on average it's paid slightly better than some of that seasonal work. And there was really no data on this. And so in Vermont or in New England, so I saw it as a really good project for me to think about. And a lot of this, as some of you know, has been connected with my work with Huertas, which is a UVM extension project where we work with farm workers to build and maintain kitchen gardens. And I'm happy to talk about how we navigated last year, for example, when we couldn't have volunteers driving in the same cars, or we had to stay 6 feet apart in the greenhouses where we do a lot of our work. And so one of the things that was quickly interesting to me is that when I did this first quantitative research, which was using the USDA Household Food Security Module, which is the main survey instrument that's used nationally to understand rates of food insecurity at the household level, only about 18% of the households were classified as food insecure. That's much lower than we would see in other farm worker communities. An important issue, though, still is social sustainability, that we're seeing elevated and disproportionate rates of food insecurity for this community. But I quickly realized, as soon as I started doing those surveys, was the really poor fit for that instrument and the realities that farm workers are experiencing. For example, the ways that it defines a household is really not well suited for individuals who might be maintaining a household back in Mexico through sending remittances to support their family and living and working sometimes within a different household here. So that just immediately opened up a number of questions for me. The other thing that quickly became really obvious is that after doing this survey, inevitably someone would say, okay, well, I have the money to buy food, but let me tell you about all of the difficult navigations that I have to go through in order to get to the grocery store or to send a list to the grocery store. And so my qualitative research really sought to complement this and to extend some of what I saw as inaccurate data that were coming out from the surveys themselves. And so main big findings in this book are that the reasons why farm workers in Vermont face food insecurity are different than other farm worker communities. The fact that we are a border state where Border Patrol is very active in a lot of the key dairy producing counties in the state meant and continues to mean that farm workers are often very nervous about leaving the home to get basic needs. It's very rural, and even though we do have the ability for farm workers in the state to get a driver's permission card, that's a state policy that does nothing about, again, the presence and the jurisdiction of Border Patrol. And a lot of farm workers are not getting licenses because, as you might imagine, if you're undocumented, putting your name on a list at the DMV might not be exactly in your mind, in your best interests. So there's a lot of dependency on other people to access food. All of these things were really coming through the surveys to a small degree, but much more so in the interviews that I did as a part of this. And as has been a great source of distress to me, there is not exactly a wealth of Mexican products in the state. Finding foods that are culturally familiar or culturally appropriate is incredibly difficult in Vermont, but people are doing it. And a lot of what the book explores is the really intricate ways that people bring food into their homes that does have meaning, including through this gardening project. So again, one of the other main findings is that how we understand food insecurity, I was really inspired by Patricia Allen's second article that I talked about, is that we really need to rethink how we measure food insecurity for transnational families, and also in ways that don't over prioritize the links between having money and having food, because of course that's important, but that's not the only thing in accessing food. All of those other dynamics came through in the other parts of the research. It also doesn't allow us to think about how people are really resilient and creative, and a lot of the book explores that. So, we're in a really interesting moment now in Vermont where things have changed quite radically. We have some really excellent research about increased rates of food insecurity in general in the state. But what I've been paying close attention to are the conversations around labor. And I would say we have kind of both sides happening in some really somewhat unexpected ways. And so recently and currently it's in progress at the state level. Vermont passed legislation that is opening up state administered funds to give stimulus funds to everybody who is left out of that first round of the $1,200 stimulus. California had a similar example, wasn't quite up to the same level actually. So what's happening currently, after a really hard fought set of arguments on the part of Migrant Justice, as well as NOFA Vermont, is that anyone who is left out of that first round of stimulus because they were undocumented or married to someone who is undocumented or out of status for other reasons is now eligible to make a claim for stimulus money, which in my mind is incredibly important. And it's also recognizing their essential nature to our state. At the same time, in my beloved city market co-op, after months of workers receiving bonus pays for, again, the extra risk that they're putting themselves out for in terms of contagion and exposure, right now, the union at City Market is arguing that they want to keep that hazard pay extended. As we've seen positive cases start happening, and the downtown store was closed not too long ago. And management is saying that they can't do that. And so in a place where you might expect there to be a bit more social sustainability possible, it's not necessarily happening in ways that I would expect. And so I think these conversations around labor in our state are really fascinating and reveal, I think, an important way that we should all check our assumptions really of what will and what can happen. So I want to talk about three main openings, and this is kind of a bit of a jarring transition, but it's going to connect back, I promise. So again, when we revisit the social side of sustainability essay, there were a lot of things happening, but a lot of new actions and activities and discourses have resulted. And I'm going to talk about three. And these are three discussions that I've started connecting with my own research, with my own teaching, and with a new set of reflections on some of the discussions I advance about labor justice in my book. So the first thing is, I think this opening for thinking about decolonization of sustainable agriculture is incredibly exciting. And this is not to say that 30 years ago, there was an active discussion around decolonization within Indigenous communities in the United States, but how that's connected to food and agriculture and well-being and health, I think is a very important conversation that we need to be paying attention to. So I put a couple of book titles up that I feel like are really sort of instrumental readings. The first by Mahesua and Hoover, which is about Indigenous food sovereignty in the United States. And the second, which is actually a wonderful cookbook called Decolonize Your Diet, which is about sort of thinking about pre-Hispanic forms of eating within Mesoamerica. And I use this quote from the first book to really think about how this set of conversations is requiring us to rethink what food sovereignty means and what sustainable agriculture means, because of how we might think differently about responsibilities to and culturally, ecologically, and spiritually appropriate relationships with elements of food systems. And so the tenor of this conversation is incredibly inspiring to me. Whether it's Sean Sherman and some of the work that he's doing with the Sous Chef project and the restaurant that he's soon to be opening up, or conversations around decolonization within Mexican foodways. I think that this, in so many ways, answers and provides a bit more stability to that sort of wobbly pillar of social sustainability. And I feel like the more heard this conversation can be, the closer we get to achieving, a truly sort of sustainable food system. The second opening that I'm seeing is the linkage between the Black Lives Matter movement and food. Really exciting book was just released by two anthropologists who I consider good friends, Ashanti Reese and Hannah Garth. Was really excited to see this come out. An edited volume called Black Food Matters is making the explicit linkage between a concern around violence against Black bodies with ongoing violence through food. And how health has been compromised, whether it's through food apartheid or whether it's through, USDA inequitable lending, all of these kinds of problems that we know are very pervasive. The other more sort of applied work, but also deeply theoretical work, Leah Penniman's project, Mosel Fire Farm, really requires us, I think, to come to terms with the fact that, as she notes, racism is built into the DNA of the US food system, right? That this is not separable. It is absolutely core to how our food system has developed in this country. And I think this last piece, the system is built on stolen land and stolen labor and needs redesign. That conversation, again, I think is something that we desperately need to really integrate into our conversations of sustainable food. It's been really inspiring to me. And I think what's also really important about this are the linkages that are being made, even in this brief quote, between the struggles of Black communities in the United States and the dispossession of Indigenous communities and the exploitation of migrant workers, right? That we are seeing these as different faces of one big, I would say, crappy problem, right? That we can look at it from different angles, but ultimately it comes down to this structural issue that Patricia Allen and Carolyn Sachs were talking about. The third piece reconnects with my book. And one of the chapters that I explore is the role of something called worker-driven social responsibility, which for those of you who are familiar with what's happened in Vermont in recent years, there's been a really exciting extension of a worker-driven social responsibility model that really, I think, was formulated through the work of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and their Fair Food program, and has been extended and replicated with some adaptations through the Milk with Dignity program that was signed now 3.5 years ago, with Ben and Jerry's. Right now, Migrant Justice is in a campaign with Hannaford to bring Hannaford into that model. And I think one of the openings that this presents us is a way of thinking about what does just work look like, right? What are fair workplaces? And rather than taking a corporate CEO's understanding of what fairness means and sort of boiling that down into something that might, get a label slapped on it, worker-driven social responsibility as an approach that unites, sweatshop workers and a number of different people, working people. This opens up, I think, a very important conversation about who has the best knowledge of what good work looks like. And this argument is it's the workers themselves. And so the fact that this has gained traction, it's now being written about, it's now being theorized, I think is a really exciting place for us to think about social sustainability. So I'm going to wrap up there, and I'm happy to talk about any of this in more detail. Again, this was sort of a detour through my pandemic mind, the hours that I spend now not commuting, but sitting and looking out my window. These are some things that I think, again, when we revisit what we really want our food system to look like, of course, there's really significant barriers, right? Of course, there's really significant challenges. But these openings, in a moment where we all need a lot of inspiration and sort of something to look forward to, I think are things that we all might want to devote some attention to as we look forward. So I'll stop there. And I'm happy to answer any questions or have any points of conversation, talk more about the research or any of these other points. But thanks so much for listening to the interiors of my mind for a little bit.
Thanks, Teresa. Also, I'll ask my own question while I'm waiting for those to come in. So you talked about how the instruments that are used for measuring food insecurity are sort of premised on the idea that money is the sole determinant of folks' food security. And what you found was that for farm workers in Vermont, people were food insecure for reasons other than lack of money. And I'm curious that in your work with Huertas or with immigrants in the Seattle area or anything else, have you found cases where factors other than money enable people to be more food secure than their financial situation might suggest, so the other way around?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of what I got to with the fact that, an instrument like the USDA Household Food Security Survey module, which is a very long term for a pretty short instrument, it is framed around an idea of absence, right? I think when we think about food insecurity, even the way that we frame it and the discourses that sort of circulate within it is it's about absence, lack, right? Gaps, failures. It doesn't really formulate any understanding for us of how do people actually cope with that, right? And this was actually something that was really instrumental early on in my research career. As an undergraduate, I was involved with an ethnographic field school up on the Pine Ridge Reservation. We were looking essentially at how people get by in a really cash poor economy, right? Very economically depressed place, but people are still living, people are still getting by. So that was a really influential piece for me of thinking about, as we study social problems like food insecurity, how can we also pay attention to the everyday ways that people are getting by and making a living? And so what I've seen with respect to farm workers in Vermont is that, again, money isn't often the main problem. And this is not to say that people are always fairly paid or are paid what they're worth or have no economic challenges. But what I've seen is that, sometimes the economic issue is that they want to send more money back to their families. And so sometimes they're managing a little bit less than perhaps they need. But in terms of the resilience factor, right, whether it is really entrepreneurial activities, there's a number of women in the community who cook meals for farm workers and deliver them, or have sort of pop-up restaurants where they serve amazingly delicious and culturally familiar foods to people, right? That's meeting a real need for, again, a more well-rounded understanding of food security. There's also, some really sort of, again, important ways that people growing a portion of their own food is meeting some of these needs in a non-economic way. I know that, Sam, you're really interested in sort of the non-economic, or we could say outside of capitalism. I don't know where you're at with your terminology, but the more non-monetized ways that we might access food. And so what we see in the work that we do with this gardening project is that, growing a portion of one's own food, even for a few months out of the summer, meets a number of needs that go beyond just sort of the rational economic, right? It's about having the particular kind of chili that you want, or having the particular herb that is medicinal, and having immediate access to that, right? As we all might enjoy who are gardeners, like going out and picking something fresh, right? That freshness is kind of difficult to monetize or to assign an economic value to, but it brings more sort of what might be called sort of sensual pleasure, or cultural familiarity, that I think is really an important piece of food security, which we don't necessarily have easy ways of measuring. So I'm an anthropologist because I like the immeasurable. I like the the non-quantifiable kinds of dimensions of life. And I've seen that a lot in how people are accessing food here, for sure.
Thanks. Okay, well, now we have tons of questions. Thanks, everybody. Okay, well, I'll start from the top and try to combine similar ones if there are. But Cheryl Herrick of the UVM Center for Sustainable Ag says, hi, Teresa. What do you wish we in Extension knew about the lives and rights of Vermont immigrant farmers? if you could wave a magic wand over our work, what would you change so we could support a more equitable food system in Vermont?
Yeah, so Cheryl, that's such a great question. And I think first thing is that there's some really fantastic programs in extension that are serving farm worker needs, right? The Bridges to Health program, which I collaborate really closely with Naomi Wolcott-McCausland. I think there's already, in migrant ed, there's a really great grounded set of knowledge, within extension already around farm workers, within the programs that specifically serve them. I think that one of the things that perhaps might be again, knowing the silos that exist between, all entities within large institutions, I think there would be a really exciting potential for a cross extension for some of that knowledge and grounded understanding of farm workers' experiences to be shared in maybe unexpected places, right? 4-H or FNEP, I know, has some connection to the work of Bridges to Health. But I think that that would be, to me, a really exciting opportunity, is to break down some of those silos within extension and, to really share what I see as really rich sets of knowledge and experiences working with the farm worker community across the different sort of entities within extension. I think that that's maybe probably the biggest piece. In terms of what extension is sort of tasked with doing. Yeah.
Alejandra Guzman asks, well, thank you for this talk, to hear from you. I'd like to know if you've had a chance to share your findings regarding food insecurity with undocumented farm workers or their employers, and if so, what were the reactions?
Yeah. So I've been on a bit of a speaking, not a speaking / zooming tour, I guess, where I've tried to share this with basically anyone who will listen to me, and that includes service providers. I've done some talks for the health department and for a lot of the hunger councils that are active, and in my own relationships with farm workers have shared that. I also work closely with migrant justice, and so the book was in everyone's hand, and tried to share as much as I could through that. I have shared this story with farm owners, and I was actually really fortunate last year, the early part of last year, to be on a panel with a farm owner who employs a number of men from Mexico. And he wasn't exactly surprised, I would say. He was in a part of the state that I hadn't spent that much time in. But he wasn't necessarily surprised by the findings. But I think, as we might expect, he was like, well, this isn't happening on my farm, right? He wanted to sort of dislocate it from his own sort of employment practices. And so I think that was probably the, not a surprising response. He wanted to distance it, but he heard me, right? He listened to me, and he was all too ready to acknowledge the fact that living and working conditions on farms are far from perfect. And so I found that hopeful. But yeah, I've tried to share this pretty widely locally through a number of different channels. And my hope is that sort of a next phase of this will be translating some of this into a more accessible format than a 200-page book. Yeah.
So a question from Andrew.
Mm-hmm.
Have you peripherally noticed any changes among farmer employers' politics with respect to immigration and worker human rights in the context of these issues, mm-hmm. possibly becoming more visible or more divisive in the last few years?
Yeah. I mean, I haven't really, to be really clear, I haven't spent as much time talking to farm owners as I probably would like, and as I probably should, sort of anecdotally or peripherally, from my vantage point. I feel like it hasn't necessarily become more divisive. I have seen, and there's a really great 7 Days piece about this actually about a year and a half ago, about how especially support for Trump was, very pervasive in a number of rural areas and within dairy families, to the point where it was somewhat at odds with their own labor needs, right? That you are politically supporting a person who wants to not have these individuals present supporting your business. And so I haven't personally noticed any more divisive kinds of relationships. I haven't really been in a place to notice that. But what I have noticed is that, especially I think, with some of the really good success that has happened under the Milk with Dignity program, which they've released a pretty good report detailing what's happened, is that again, the importance of these workers, not just for sort of economic reasons, but for broader questions of cultural resilience and cultural diversity, are a bit more open as conversations. So that was a long roundabout way of answering a question that I don't entirely have an answer for, but I haven't noticed it becoming more divisive, but it could have become that way.
That's really interesting. So Meredith Niles says, thanks for such a great presentation, and that we've also found in our work among the general population of Vermont and nationally that this economic lens that you're talking about of the USDA's food security measurement really ignores all these other issues around food security, especially since COVID-19, like physical access and accessibility and other factors. Mm-hmm. And so talking about the narrow mindset of economics being the reason people are food insecure. So she says, I know that others at UVM have tried to modify these scales for new American populations. And do you think that's an approach that should happen here, where there are different scales for different populations? Or more broadly, do you think that the USDA revisit its premise that people in the US are food insecure because of economic reasons only?
Yeah, that's such an important question, Meredith. Thanks for that. So I would say all of the above. Yes, I think that we need to revisit that premise that economic reasons are primary. Of course, they are important, right? And poverty as a proxy for food insecurity is, of course, a very important connection, right? But I do think that we need to revisit that premise. I think that, that survey has its usefulness. It's very quick to administer. You can do it over the phone. You can do thousands of these surveys, very quickly. And so there is the sort of big data value question behind it. But I do think that one of the hopeful outcomes of this project that I've been exploring getting some funding for is to revisit this scale with immigrant families in mind. And I do think that there are actually a number of common experiences talking with some people who have done that research with the New American community. There are some parallels that exist in terms of the other reasons that people are food insecure beyond money. But how do we then introduce sort of variabilities around citizenship? Because, for example, if you are here with some kind of a visa, or if you have been formally resettled, you have a very different access to public space than if you are undocumented and you're fearful of that public space. So I think that, there is the value of having an instrument that is attuned both to like a broader sort of experience of being transnational, of having multiple homes that you relate to perhaps. But I do think that it would have to be pretty fine-tuned for thinking about, what are some of the differences around citizenship, or living in a rural area versus living in an urban area. But I'm hopeful that I'm not, even as much as I am like drawn to qualitative methods and feel like I'm much more comfortable with qualitative methods, I don't think that quantitative methods are impossible for this question. I just think that hopefully redesigning some of those tools is hopefully in the cards. And yeah, I'm hoping that I can spend a little bit of my time thinking about that. I can see the questions. So the next one is exciting to me.
So Carlos Andres says, thanks so much, Teresa. Great presentation. Seeing the three pillars you presented in question from an Indigenous perspective, which I believe would include mestizo farmers across Latin America and the Caribbean, does this compartmentalization even make sense?
I love that question. That's such a great question. Yeah, I think that opens up a really important piece of sort of deconstruction. And I think that is actually where some of the discussions around Indigenous food sovereignty or decolonization are actually pushing us to rethink that compartmentalization. I'm trying to put that in Spanish and English at the same time. that sort of dividing out, yeah, the social world from the ecological world is I think reflective of a particular worldview that might not necessarily be relevant or adhere to within Indigenous communities. So yeah, I think that I love that question. That makes me rethink this whole talk as another sort of slide to think about. But I do think that yeah, anytime as an anthropologist that I see neat boundaries or neat compartments, I'm like, there's got to be more messiness there. And I think that you're right that there's definitely a way that we want to challenge some of those divisions, taking into account, I think, worldviews that don't compartmentalize in the same sort of dominant Western way.
That's potent. So I want to say that we have 11 minutes left, but only one question left. So if anybody else can think of another great question or okay question, and there's no stupid questions, write it in the Q&A and I'll read it. Otherwise, I'll just ask Teresa exactly about what I'm interested in. So one more question from our fearless leader, Taylor Ricks, or societies that are good examples of supporting food security in the broader sense you're describing. Who are already seeing and acting on the openings you listed?
Yeah. So yeah, that's a really important question. So I think some of the openings that organizations that are opening on that, I think some of the work that Soulflower Farm is doing is, again, as an example of that, linking sort of the call to recognize the value and the worth of Black life with food. I feel like that project is incredibly exciting, incredibly important. And I would say, some of the other kind of what I see as things happening on the horizon. Actually, a friend of mine from graduate school in Northern California is starting this collaborative she's calling Earth Seed Laboratories that is linking abolition with food justice and with supporting sort of the health of her community within, both food and sort of medicinal crops. So yeah, I feel like there's a number of really exciting examples. I mentioned the work of Sean Sherman. A few weeks ago, there was a really great New York Times piece about another colleague of mine from graduate school, Claudia Serrato, who does some really great work around, again, sort of the decolonization of the Mexican diet. So what I feel like is it's kind of this moment where there's a lot of really interesting things happening, and we're in a moment where they might start converging a bit, or hopefully, sharing information across these different projects and sites. But yeah, Taylor, I'm happy to share any, sometimes it's kind of the informal stuff, really. It's like the links that, these small projects, or, in the case of Soulflower Farm, a much more visible project, are doing. And I'm excited for the moment in which there's a lot more talking across those projects, which I think is happening too.
Question from Aura. Thank you so much for engaging Talk Teresa. As a somewhat new food consumer in the state of Vermont, what can we do to contribute to food justice and support for migrant farm workers in the state in terms of our food choices, considering our limited budgets as grad students?
Oh yes, I remember, I knew that limited budget well. And Ben and Jerry's as a product is not super cheap, although you can get it on sale, and you can rest assured that milk is, at least produced in Vermont, is coming through the Milk with Dignity program. Honestly, when I'm asked this question, I 9.9 times out of 10 say, look at the work that Migrant Justice is doing and see what calls for action they're putting out there. Currently, there's a coming day of action, hoping to, again, remind Hannaford about the potential for them coming into the Milk with Dignity program. I say that both in a detached sense as an academic studying this topic, but also as someone who, has some ongoing involvement, that I feel like, again, with that emphasis on worker-driven models, that I am particularly excited about the work that Migrant Justice does, because the directions of the organization, the priorities, the campaigns are driven by farm workers. And that to me is reason enough for me to get excited about that work, but also I know that it's situated within a knowledge and a set of experiences of what is needed. And so, their campaigns are very active and very visible, and often require very little to no money to support.
So you answered Maya's question before I could even get to it about how to support organizations working on this in Vermont. So another one from Meredith Niles, going back to that questions about social sustainability. You talked about how it's harder to measure than economic or environmental outcomes in some way. Do you think there are current metrics that are useful to understand social sustainability, and what work needs to be done to better understand social metrics, or can we not measure these things?
Yeah, I don't think they're immeasurable. I think it takes a lot of creativity to think about how do you set up a metric for something as complex as racial oppression, right? That's incredibly difficult. Where I started my career, my research career, I was really, really excited about social capital. And at that point, what was called the Social Capital Assessment Tool, which had the horrible acronym of SCAT. And that tool, which has been used, and I've been actually involved in administering some of this, used a metric to try to understand the strength of social connectivity in the community. I think things like that, I know that particular tool had been really rigorously tested and thought about, how do we employ it in very different kinds of communities with very different dynamics around social connectivity. So while I'm not really familiar with metrics that are trying to get at, the examples that I brought up from Allen and Sachs. I mean, you can bring in average wages, you can, a lot of conversations are happening right now about women's increased work because of the pandemic in the home. I'm not aware of metrics that can really get to that, but I do think outside of food, there have been some interesting models to try to quantify some of those, less easily measurable things. I saw that Chris Campbell was on here a little bit ago, so maybe, there's some ideas there. Yeah.
All right, we have 5 minutes. So this might be the last question. It's from Katie Horner, and it's one that it's one that I'd like to be able to wrap my head around. So we often acknowledge that on all levels, conventional dairy as it currently exists is unsustainable. So how can we continue to center migrant farm workers in the work of envisioning and creating new ag systems beyond the industrial dairy farms where they're often employed?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question, Katie. And I think that, in many ways, it's interesting that in supporting farm workers, in an interesting way, we're not challenging large scale dairy, right? That isn't necessarily part of the equation. And if we are to re-envision sort of more small scale dairy economies or dairy systems, that might actually not require the same kinds of labor patterns that we see in large dairies. So I think it's a really complicated question, but I do think that there is this interesting balance to raise about, like, is it about the scale? Is the scale that's the problem? Or is it what that scale enables? And to me, it's less about the size. I've become one of those converts to, like, we need farming of all sizes, large, medium, and small. But I do think that, again, larger scale systems allow a certain amount of or a certain lack of transparency, a certain distancing, all of these things that we know are not necessarily amenable to sustainable food systems. And so to me, I think that there is a possibility of reforming large scale industrial production that still allows for fair workplaces for farm workers without it necessarily becoming a question of scale, because I don't think it's actually a question of scale. I think it's, again, what scale enables more than anything.
Well, that's certainly something to leave us with. Thanks, Teresa. So on behalf of the Gun Institute, I want to thank both Teresa and everyone who joined us online. We'll have the video and the podcast of today's talk available next week or very shortly thereafter. So please join us again next Friday for our next gun exchange that I'm really looking forward to. Charles Hall, who's an emeritus professor at the State University of New York, SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, is going to be talking about 50 years of EROI, with energy return on energy invested, a unifying principle for ecology, economics, and sustainability. So that's next Friday, March 5th, same time. Thank you, and see you then.
Thanks, everybody.